Hi, I'm Dr. Tammy Nelson. Welcome back. This is Module 4. We're still talking about monogamy issues. This is integrative relationship therapy, and we're talking about intentional divorce. And if you've been aware of my work in the past, intentional divorce is actually personal to me. We've taught classes at the Institute, but we have looked at it from many different angles. As an imago therapist, I'd like to give some credit to Wendy Patterson, who I have done talks with and done presentations with her around this idea of intentional divorce. And you're going to find handouts in your resource section that you can use with your intentional divorce clients. Intentional divorce is personal to me as someone who's been divorced and remarried. And so I'm going to use myself as examples along the way. And as someone who's been a therapist for over 35 years, I know that I've seen a lot of people who have been struggling with whether or not to stay in their marriage, and people who have gone through divorce or are currently divorcing and the aftermath of divorce. So really, divorce is our current model of ending and shifting out of marriage, which we've talked earlier in this module about the traditional mode of marriage and its legal implications. And here we're going to talk about the social, legal, emotional, and even the energetic implications of divorce. So divorce rates are declining somewhat, mostly because people are not getting married as often and they're getting married later. But they're still hovering around 50% for first marriages. So many of you watching this course may have been divorced or maybe even divorced more than once. And so this may be a sensitive topic for you as the clinician and as a person. So I would encourage you to take care of yourself. In the last module, or the last module in this course, module 5, we're going to talk about self-care for the therapist. But I would encourage you to be aware of any feelings that come up for you and take breaks if you need to. Remarriage is on the rise for those 55 and over. So one of the things that I've noticed in treating a lot of therapists and supervising a lot of therapists is that we tend to divorce more than a lot of other career paths, but it may be because we happen to be an older career. So in other words, we need a lot of education to be therapists, and we improve sort of like fine wine. You know, the older we get, the better we are at our jobs, and so we tend to see therapists a lot in training and in supervision who have been around for a while. And so the older we are, the more chance there is that we have lived longer relationships, and the potential for having multiple monogamous or back-to-back marriages is greater. Now, interestingly, divorce rates have been going down somewhat, except for those over 50. And so we call that gray divorce. Gray divorce accounts for about 10 out of 1,000 couples over 50. So the rates of people over 50 getting divorced is greater. I think partly because we live longer, and we used to get divorced and have a very short period of sexual proclivity. And now we live to be well into our 80s, sometimes into our 90s, and there's an expectation of staying sexual well into our 80s. In fact, the highest rate of sexually transmitted diseases is people in their 80s. So we continue to have this desire to be sexual and to partner with people for many years into our old age. And so the idea that we could have multiple partners and multiple marriages makes sense. When we lived to be 38, we pretty much stayed with the same person until we were dead. Now there is the potential, there's the time, and many of us stay healthy to have multiple marriages. So if we look back to the times when we lived to be 38, marriages lasted about 14 to 18, 20 years. And interestingly, that's about the length of time that they last now. So gray divorce makes sense that people are marrying in their late 20s and getting married, or in their 30s even, and getting divorced in their 50s. The problem with gray divorce is it's really financially devastating, particularly for women. Few women form unions after divorce. In other words, they don't necessarily move in with people after they get divorced. More men will move in or get remarried than women. And so financially, this has contributed to the really growing economic problem among people over 60. We see this sort of idea of gray divorce in Hollywood a lot. In particular, Bill and Melinda Gates just got divorced, and people were really shocked because they seemed like such a nice couple. He was 65, I think she was 56. But you see it all over Hollywood. And we used to have this cliche that they would get divorced, the male in the couple would marry a younger woman. It's not necessarily the case. What does happen is we do see people who are married for an average of 12 to 20 years, and then they marry someone else. Females actually experience a 45% decline in their standard of living. Men, standard of living only drops by about 20%. But the difference is the decline will persist over time for men, and they only reverse for women if they re-partner, either move in with someone or get married. So that 60 to 67% of second marriages ending in divorce usually happens after people are being married for a shorter period of time than their first marriages. And there's usually about 3 years in between marriages. It is true that for heterosexual couples, men marry much faster and tend to marry a second time, whereas women will avoid marriage or move in together or take longer to marry the second time. 64%, in fact, of men will get married, and only about 50% of women get married again. But the average length of marriage prior to divorce is only 8 years. In other words, most people get divorced around the 8-year mark. We see 12 to 20 years in the therapy world, in the clinical world, which means that not everyone who gets divorced is going to therapy first. So 8 years of marriage is usually, after that magical 7-year itch time, but also it's a developmental marker in marriage. It's a developmental time where they've either had small children, decided to have children, or decided not to have children, and the markers in the marriage have changed, right? So the mission of the marriage has changed. They've gone through the idealized romantic stage, and they've moved into the conflict stage, or the power struggle of their marriage, and realized that they're stuck and they can't get out, and they're grieving the vision that they thought they had of what it was going to be. And when it feels like it's too wounding and they can't get out and they can't figure a way out, the choice to exit and trade their partner in for someone else becomes too much of a positive option. It also, for some people, getting divorced when the kids are young, having kids is much more of a shock than people talk about. Giving birth is much more traumatic for many people than they talk about, because we want to believe that having kids is such a beautiful experience that how can it be traumatic? But for many women, the birth experience is incredibly painful, and it doesn't go smoothly, and it's in a cold and sterile environment, and it's not supportive of the mother's trauma around the birthing process. And we don't take care of women postnatally. And so if the relationship isn't connected in a way that recognizes the need for that support and deals with the incredible stress of having a newborn, many times by the time the kid is old enough to tie their shoes or make their own breakfast, the parents look up and look around and go, oh my God, I can't believe we just did that. I can't believe we survived that. And you were not there for me on some level. And the resentment many times drives people to separate. We see each other in different roles and through different lenses. We also get triggered from our own parental histories and realize that we're either reenacting or getting triggered from our own past. And those triggers, if they're not dealt with in therapy, can lead to separation. And because divorce is an option in our country, it's really about ending relationships. You know, we have this lovely sort of mythological view of marriage that you marry once, you fall in love, you stay in love forever, you ride off into the sunset. It's always a happy ending. But the reality is it's just a relationship. Marriage is a relationship, and many relationships have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But we see divorce as the tragedy that it has become in our culture. And we're not good at transitions. We're not good at endings. We're very good at the beginning of relationships, falling in love, the romanticizing of that wonderful, powerful, sexual, erotic energy. But we're not great at the ending of relationships. We have ghosting, we have affairs, we have betrayal, we have a lot of ways of handling endings that are not mature, and we pathologize the endings of relationships, and it sets up the grief process. And we're not also trained as therapists to believe that divorce is a healthy option for many couples. That divorce is an option for therapists to provide support for couples to end their relationship. That marriage may have an expiration date. That it's possible to learn everything you can from a partner and for that relationship to be done. And to complete your marriage instead of your marriage failing. The idea that a marriage is successful only if it stays together forever is an interesting one, particularly for therapists. If you're a marriage and family therapist or a couples therapist, you've sort of been trained to believe that you have to save someone's marriage. And again, that puts us in that rescuer position that we've talked about, that it actually is a recreation of a trauma model. So we are not the rescuers of people's marriage. What we are is the coach in helping people to understand what will work for them, what's the best option for their lifestyle. Now, because of the legal model in our country, in the U.S. and in parts of the Western world, divorce is very expensive, very adversarial, and can wreak havoc on not just our emotional life, but our financial life, and on our children's lives. But we continue to do it, and we continue to do it in the same way that we've been doing it. And it happens quite often. There's one divorce every 30 seconds in this country. So what is the cause of divorce? It may seem obvious to us as therapists why relationships fail, but statistically, there are some specific reasons. Affairs are not necessarily the cause of divorce, although they do appear in divorce documents. But the major cause of divorce from the Gottman Institute, nearly 80% of the time, is that people become emotionally distant and drift apart. The most common cause cited in the legal documents as reason for divorce is lack of commitment. So that one person in the marriage just isn't committed, however that appears in the relationship. Other causes, 58% report arguing and just excess conflict. So they can't get out of that stuck cycle that we've been talking about. 45% say they married too young, and 38% report that money issues are the problem. Money and financial problems are the issue. And interestingly, 66% of men and 74% of women think their partner should have worked harder to save the marriage. They think the other person should have worked harder to save the marriage. And over 70% of people who divorce report the reason as they did not understand the realities or stages of marriage. So it's obviously really hard to understand what marriage is going to be like. And when people say, oh, relationships are work, I mean, that makes sense. But deeper or more granular, when we say that, what we really mean is that marriage is developmental. It goes through many stages, and it goes through developmental life markers just like we do as individuals. So as individuals grow and we change and shift, our relationships change and shift. And riding those waves, particularly when there's crisis and grief and trauma, can be overwhelming for some people. The average age of people who divorce is 46 for men and 44 for women. So if you think about the developmental changes that people have gone through, they have come through the phases of having young children. They've come through developing a career path or trying to, and they are expanding on who they are as people. So as we work with people to help them understand what exactly change means, what is transition, and how do we handle change from an organizational perspective, if we think of marriage as a business, as an organization, as the function of our companionship working itself through ongoing shifts and changes, we can look at what our expectations are, what our desires are versus what the realities are, and really help people assess. So I'm going to help you assess, should people get a divorce? What are the signs and the symptoms? And then how do you move people through an intentional divorce? And I'm sure you've seen people where you thought maybe this couple should get divorced. And there are cases where people stay in relationships when they shouldn't. And we've all seen that. For sure, if there's physical abuse or any kind of domestic violence, absolutely people should divorce. Compulsive sexual behavior, addiction. There are certain cases where ongoing affairs, people who really can't live in a relationship where there's too many self-destructive relationship behaviors, we know that those relationships probably should end. But there's also people who have grown up with really traumatic histories that form relationships that are like trauma bonds. And sometimes we call that betrayal trauma victims. So in other words, they pay attention to the positive in a relationship and might suppress or ignore the negative or the traumatic behaviors in their current relationship because of what they experienced as kids. So because of shame, they might see the patterns in the relationship as their fault. They perceive anything negative as, well, I must have deserved it, or it's got to be my fault, or they dissociate from it. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't see that. Betrayal trauma theory has been around for a while. It's when trauma's considered when there's trauma from the person who cared for you, usually the parent. So the perpetrator was one parent, or you had traumatic neglect of one parent, or parent who didn't protect you from the perpetrator. And it can lead to betrayal blindness, where your memory impairment for any kind of trauma or abuse in a relationship is a sign of your adaptability. Like it's the way that you adapted from your childhood. And sometimes you see that in therapy, where we talk about one thing in a session, like this horrible argument you had where somebody threw something at you and pushed you into a wall, and the next week they come in and you try to talk about that incident with high intensity and your own concern for the couple, and they seem to have dissociated it and don't remember it. That can be linked to a history of physical abuse or neglect. How do you help people shift towards an attitude of potential divorce? This is not a course on domestic violence, so we're not going to go into those type of couples, but I will give you resources in the reference section. And you should know, and of course you probably assume that by the time couples get to you in your office, they have waited, according to Gottman research, an average of 6 years before they go to therapy. I think many couples probably wait longer, or they wait until one person has already got one foot out the door and has decided to separate anyway, and they're just in couples therapy to check off the box and say, okay, we tried this. So by the time they get to you, your job is potentially impossible to save a marriage where one person is already shadow divorcing. In other words, they're pretty much out the door anyway. How do you put yourself in that position of either letting them know you can't save the divorce, but also mirroring what's happening? And also offering help, saying, I'm not just there for you until you decide to save your marriage, but I can be with you through the whole process, regardless of what happens, so that they don't just stay together for you, and then if they leave therapy, that means they leave the marriage. You don't become responsible for the marriage. Just like people can't stay together just for the kids, making the kids responsible for their marriage, although that can be a motivator. And we can talk about what are good motivators to stay together. And can we look at marriage as something that does have an expiration date, that we choose someone, we talked about partner selection, we choose someone who is going to heal us from many of our childhood wounds, who's going to mirror back the parts of us that we need to look at and where we need to grow. And when those parts have grown and healed and found ways to integrate, to reintegrate, then when we become integrated enough, we either go into the next phase of growth and our conflicts change, the power struggle shifts, we learn different parts of ourselves. Or we can say, thank you, I've grown, it's time to move on. And we can grow out of relationship with each other. So there's a difference between saying, thank you, this was very powerful, we got a lot out of it, I really appreciate everything that we've learned from each other, versus leaving and slamming the door, or creating a trauma and a crisis so that one of us has to make the decision to leave. And couples therapy is not necessarily the thing that's going to save people or prevent divorce. You know, if you're gearing your positive treatment outcome and your successes on people staying together, and you're seeing yourself as the savior of marriage, you're going to fail 50% of the time, or 67% of the time if it's a second marriage, and 73% of the time if it's a third marriage. So your success rates are not going to be that great. So you might want to reevaluate what is your positive treatment outcome. And know that couples therapy is not going to work if one person comes in with one foot out the door, or if they've decided to separate already and they're just using you to do it. They're just using you to be the voice, just like someone would use an affair to be the can opener. Sometimes people use therapy to be able to soften the blow, or to be able to find the words that they need that they can't find on their own. So some of the indicators that therapy won't work include, unwillingness to address the issues. They've already said, you know what, I'm done with talking about this. I don't really want to do the work to change. And I don't really want to be emotionally vulnerable either. Continuing to blame the other person, continuing to have affairs, making the choice to be in the exits outside of the relationship instead of closing the exits and being in the conflict. And maybe divorce is just natural. Maybe like we are prone to come together, and just like all seasons of everything, maybe we're prone to get together. There's a time of growth, time of expansion, and then a time of separation. Recently, there is an article, and I include this in your resources in Science News, finding out that birds actually get divorced too. So interestingly, 90% of birds actually are monogamous, but there's a difference between having a mate for life and having offspring that actually come from that mate. So some birds will actually, in addition to that, leave their mate for life and search for a new mate. And so they call that phenomena bird divorce. And some will actually cheat. So they've been able to look at the eggs in nests of birds that they previously thought were monogamous, and they found that those eggs actually come from multiple partners. So even in birds that mate for life, the females will go out and partner with other birds to make sure they perpetuate their offspring. If the female birds get caught with that, many times the couple will stay together, the bird couple. If a male goes out and tries to find another partner, the birds will break up, and that's called bird divorce. So interestingly, if you're into birds, if you want to know this, the birds with the highest divorce rates have the highest male promiscuity. Those are plovers, swallows, martins, orioles, and blackbirds. And the lowest divorce rates and the lowest male promiscuity are white petrels, albatrosses, geese, and swans. And everyone thinks that geese and swans mate for life, and they kind of do, but they also occasionally divorce. Both woodpeckers and bluebirds, who we thought were totally monogamous, have nests containing mixed offspring from multiple females, multiple males, or both. And this is another interesting thing when we think about living together, not living together, or what I call living apart together relationships, or when we think about couples that travel for work and how affairs many times happen because of opportunity. They found that pairs of birds that migrate over longer distances have higher divorce rates. So the birds that travel more often, the birds that maybe have higher stress jobs, the birds that are also exposed to more partners. So in birds where both sexes have exposure to larger populations of birds, they have more options. They tend to have more partners. What the article says is they're more polygamous, which I don't know if that's the right use of the word. Polygamous means being married to more than one person. But when the population has more of the opposite sex, that sex has more partners, and they tend to have more divorce. So in other words, if there's more males in the species, the males will divorce and fool around and meet more partners. If there's more females, the females have more choice, and they'll do the same. So the rarer sex has more opportunity to play the field and cheat on their partner or leave their partner in favor of a new mate. And that makes sense in our society, since there is a tendency to be more cheating in places where there's more options. So let's talk about intentional divorce. If birds do it, clearly we're doing it, how can we do it better? Because for most of us who've been through divorce, the emotionality of it is incredibly devastating. It's hard on kids. It's financially just, for most people, difficult, even Bill and Melinda Gates. And how do we do it in a way that's more conscious? And how can we look at it as, instead of failing our marriage, we're completing our marriage? Maybe we've completed our work together and we've come to the end of the road. How do we do it in a way that's workable? You know, we spend millions of dollars a year on weddings, on the celebration, the ritual of coming together, on getting a dress or a suit or having the big party, on the food, on the liquor, on the celebration, on the band, and we buy gifts and we travel and we have honeymoons, all of that money going to celebrating the wedding. But when we get divorced, when we come to the completion, there is no ritual. There is no grief process that is ritualized. We, shake each other's hand on the courthouse steps and move on, and that pain is not ritualized in a way that can be expressed and supported. Sometimes, there's grief groups and there's divorce support groups, but they're not integrated into our society in a way that's supportive, particularly not for women. Now, we've had a shift, and actually it's come through Hollywood. So there's a book by Catherine Woodward Thomas called Conscious Uncoupling, which Gwyneth Paltrow and Chris Martin actually made quite famous when they decided to do their conscious uncoupling. They were getting divorced, and they had read the book Conscious Uncoupling, and they created a ritual for themselves. They went to the beach and they threw stones in the ocean that represented their marriage and the letting go of their relationship. And then they talked about how beautiful that ritual was and how much they meant to each other and how they shared children and a life together, and that had meaning for them. And they got a lot of that from the book Conscious Uncoupling, which is 5 steps to living happily ever after, how to break up in a whole new way. And Catherine Woodward Thomas's book made a sort of ripple in the world around intentional divorce. In the therapeutic community, you may know Bill Doherty's work on discernment counseling. He takes couples on the brink of divorce, and there's a very structured and deliberate process about how to make decisions. Are we going to work on the marriage, or go through a separation, maybe a legal separation, or go all the way through and get a divorce? So it's very time limited, and it's very non-judgmental. So it's not about right, wrong. It's not a moral decision. It's a very well thought out cognitive, how are we going to take each person's desires into account, and then how do we move forward in a healthy way? Intentional divorce is similar. It's a divorce that's done on purpose, with respect and dignity and integrity. So it's integrating everyone's desires with a process that can work without the drama and the trauma of our past history on adversarial divorce. So the goal is to reframe the idea of divorce, to acknowledge the grief process, encourage people to take care of themselves, and to leave with some good interventions for self-care. So the reasons for doing intentional divorce seem kind of obvious, but they're not, I don't think they're intuitive. To have less trauma, you actually will have more treatment success. So you will be able to use integration. You'll have more integrity. You'll be able to integrate more of that person's life. They'll be able to work with their own family history stuff. They'll be able to work therapeutically with their issues around their own children if they have them. They'll be able to integrate support systems, friendships, and also decide what they actually do want in their next relationships when they get there. So the idea of this contemporary model of treatment is to, again, get us out of the victim, perpetrator, rescuer model. You are not the rescuer. And in intentional divorce, there's no victim and perpetrator. It's not like one person is causing the divorce. We're going to get to the point where it's an intentional decision on both people's parts. And how can we work through that for both people? And for you as the therapist, if you see treatment success only as marriage lasting and being monogamous, then it can appear on the surface to comply with that. Like they can say, oh yeah, we do all those things. Like the social norms can be in place, but that doesn't necessarily mean that under the surface, that's what people are doing. If the affair rates are so high, if their sexual connection is not working, there's many reasons that people might stay together and not be happily married. So we know that a lot of couples will stay together and say, oh, we never fight. This is great. We've been together for 60 years. Well, if you never fight, you might never talk either. So some of the couples that stay together and choose not to divorce have found creative ways to make that happen. They have 2 houses, they live separately, they live apart together, one travels more than the other, they open their relationship, they become non-monogamous. There are implicit and explicit agreements where the couple chooses to stay married legally, but has a flexible and fluid agreement. If those things don't work, divorce can become one of those options on the continuum of monogamy. It could just be the end, where we change our relationship to each other. Now, you might change your relationship to being friends, to being co-parents, and that's really, really important if you have families that you want to continue to share, whether it's in-laws or children. The idea is to assess that and complete the process, but also integrate your new relationships going forward. There was a great article years ago in the New York Times about a woman getting divorced, and I just want to read a quote. She said, "I woke up one day and realized it wasn't true. There was love, an abundance of it. We just had to respect and accept that it was not the love of happily ever after. No, we would not be celebrating our 60th wedding anniversary or even our 6th, but we would always be celebrating our children and the physical and emotional bond that brought them into being." So the idea is that you can celebrate what you do have, integrate the joy of what you had and what you brought into the world, children, a home, a shared family experience, memories, travel, without having to judge it as a failure. I have a hard time with people saying, oh, that marriage failed. I was married to my first husband for about 11 or 12 years. We were together about 17 years. And I don't consider that a failure. We have 2 beautiful children. We had a really wonderful life together, and it was completed. And so the idea that I could call that a failure would somehow imply that my kids were a failure, and that our home was a failure, and that our in-laws were a failure. And I was still very close to his parents till the end, till they died. You know, the idea that getting divorced would mean closing off everything that you've connected to in that life means that you deny the life that you've created. So how can you integrate your own experience into your new life going forward? So in intentional divorce, there's 5 stages. First, you assess. You have to make some decisions. What are we going to do and how are we going to do it? Step 2 is the crisis management. Can we assess for real danger or emotional needs, depression, anxiety? Can we bring in and integrate other professionals to help with our treatment team? Step 3 is to take action, to set some intentions, to have the insight into what needs to happen and how this could go in a way that works within the integrity of all parties. Step 4 is completion. That's the closure phase, the integration of our new roles going forward. Step 5 is the vision. So I would have you, as the therapist, reconsider what are your successful outcomes. If our culture is shifting away from getting married in your late teens, early 20s, having children, the nuclear family where the heterosexual, heteronormative, male works, female stays home, raises 2.5 kids, the husband works for the same company his whole life, retires at 55, and they die by the time they're 80. Like, how is that shifting? That is no longer the norm. So if that is no longer the norm, we can no longer go with our potential treatment outcome that we've been trained on. What is this romanticized idea we have of soulmates that we've been taught is the basis of emotional connection and relationship? That we have one soulmate, that we are not complete until we have found our other half. that we have one person that we're searching for to make us whole. That's really a codependent vision of love, that somehow we are not whole until we have another person. Instead of being a whole person and perhaps having many soulmates, that everyone you meet perhaps is your soulmate. Perhaps we have a spiritual connection with everyone in our lives. How is culture shifting in this idealized version of pair bonding? If we are evolutionary scientists, are we looking at pair bonding as only one pair, or can we pair bond with one person and then another and then another? And where is the choice around women's empowerment? Divorce was only available to women in the 60s and 70s, and we could only get child support, alimony, so it's only been 50 or 60 years since it was really an option. And the idea that divorce rates then escalated and have hovered around 50% ever since says something about how marriage actually works. Not how we think it should work, but how it actually functions. Marriage is a legal contract, but it's not a legally binding contract. We don't go to prison if we break the contract. There's an implicit and explicit contract here. The explicit agreement that we make around marriage is the promise that we make out loud to be together till death do us part, but it's not binding. There's an implicit assumption that we can get married and then we can get out of it if we need to. In the back of our minds, we can walk down the aisle and know that this does not have to be forever. There's a myth around the individualized desire for potential, that I can reach my full potential only if I'm by myself or only if I'm with another person. So how are we going to find that full potential? Are we going to replay our attachment needs in a relationship? And if you don't heal me from my attachment wounds from my early childhood, then it feels like a failure and I'll have to find someone else to do that for me? Or can I have my inner adult be fully present in the relationship and know that you can't replace my early attachment figures, but I can heal my early attachment and I can come to this relationship as an adult? Part of the crisis that happens at a developmental phase of marriage is that loss of innocence, that knowing that I could get hurt in this relationship, I'm going to choose to love you anyway. But that is an existential crisis of I am not necessarily up on the pedestal that I might have been on from my parents. That I will not be the idealized partner after the romantic phase is over. And I may have a wise adult part of me that Terry Real talks about, but I also have the inner child that wants to be loved and adored like I am the center of the universe. And I have an adaptive child that Terry Real talks about, the child in me that has created parts of myself to survive a childhood where perhaps I was not mythologized as the top of the pyramid. And so the things I've done to survive my childhood, I'm acting out in my marriage, and that may coincide with how my partner's acting out in his adaptations. And those may create the crisis that we have gotten to, where we've both decided that this marriage is not going to work out. So how do we complete the marriage? If we look at divorce as completion and not failure, how would you as a therapist do therapy differently? Can you acknowledge our adaptations worked really well as children, they're not working so well now, and can we try to work on those? And if we decide and discover that these don't necessarily mean that we're pathologically unable to connect, we can heal, then perhaps ongoing therapy is the answer. If we decide these adaptations are overly wounding and not adaptable to this relationship. In other words, no one can wound you like your partner, because we choose someone who's going to hurt us in the same way that we are hurt as children emotionally, because they have the capacity to heal us in the way that we weren't healed as children. It is possible that the wounding becomes so painful that we just tap out and say, okay, I can't do this anymore. Or that we feel like we've been healed in those places and we say, thank you, I think I'm done. How do you reframe the union and the mission of the person's marriage? How do you reframe the mission? Are you done with the mission? Have you completed your mission? What is the expiration date here? Have you completed your implicit contract with each other? What was the mission that you came here to do together, that only the two of you could do as a couple? And has that been completed? Maybe it was to have the beautiful children that you have. Maybe it was to help your parents pass. Maybe it was to build this life that you've built that can help other people. So as your therapist strategy, what is it that you can do to make people aware that you can lead them through the process, that there is a process, there's a plan? You need other resources. You don't have to be the divorce coach. You can help people advocate for their own rights, or you can find other advocates for people's potential separation. You're also allowed to make predictions. Like, this is what could happen. If you tell the kids too soon that you're going to separate, it will make them anxious. What kids are going to be concerned about is, what's going to happen to me? How's my life going to change? Am I going to keep my room? Am I going to go to the same school? How's this going to affect my daily life? So predicting, don't tell the kids until you're absolutely sure. Don't tell the kids that it's one or the other's fault. Like, there's ways that you can begin to have strategy while also educating and also predicting some outcomes. This is how it's going to affect the kids at this age. It may be better to divorce when the kids are really young instead of when they're in middle school. Like, there's ways that you can use the strategies around some of the divorce research that might be helpful. However, I just want to point out that it's different for every family. Every family is different. The more intentional you are with your divorce, the less painful it will be for children, regardless of the age that they're in. So how do you help in the assessment process? How do you help when people say, I'm done, I want out, I already have one foot out the door? One way to assess is to ask a series of questions, and I'm going to give you these 5 questions. First is this really about an affair? So sometimes when people are swept up in the new relationship energy of an affair, the excitement, the sparkliness of an affair, it can feel like, I'm going to definitely leave my wife or my husband, and this is going to be a whole new, wonderful relationship. That may or may not be true. Most likely, only 7% of people actually end up leaving for their partner, for their new partner, and most of those relationships don't work out because they're based on a foundation of cheating, so they end up not trusting each other. So do you really want this marriage to end based on your new affair? Let's just assess, wait, do some intentional integrity work around assessing the affair. My book, When You're the One That Cheats, has a lot of work and templates about how to do the work with the person who's having the affair to discern, do you want to stay? Do you want to end the affair? Do you want to end your marriage? Like, how do you decide? So I'll put that link in their resources as well. And then the second question is to ask about their sex life. Like, what's been going on in the sex life? Is it satisfying? Is it regular? There's a lot of potential if you can work on someone's erotic life. You know, there's 2 parts of the relationship. Remember, there's the companionship and there's the eroticism. Many couples feel like the energy's been drained out of the relationship. We squeezed all the juice out of it if there's no more erotic energy. You know, we might be good roommates, and then when the roommate part starts not working, what's the point of staying together if there's no erotic energy or passion? And that might be true. But before we make that decision, let's see if there's work that can be done on the erotic part of the relationship. Can we increase the desire and arousal? Go back to the section on working with sexual dilemmas and remind people about the 6 weeks to erotic recovery or doing sensate focus. There is also the certification in being a sex therapy informed professional, or you can go to the Integrative Sex Therapy Institute and learn more about being a sex therapist or a sex and couples therapist, because there's a lot of work you can do on people's sexual connection. If they've done all that work and they still find that the sex is not satisfying, they're just not compatible, they have different interests, they have different sexual orientations, different gender struggles, then perhaps that is a sign like it's okay to leave. I have a couple where one, they were hetero focused when they got married, and he has had several affairs with men and has decided that he really wants to be in a committed emotional relationship with a man. She doesn't want to be in an open relationship. She doesn't feel emotionally connected to being in a throuple, and she wants to be in a relationship with someone who's focused on her as a primary partner, so they're getting divorced. And that seems like it's working for them, as painful as it is and as betrayed as she feels, because she feels like he should have told her from the beginning. That's a story altogether. You might look up Joe Court's work for that, for those references and resources. Number 3, finding out where their support system is. If they have a lot of family, their kids or grandkids, or are they having a lot of conversations around, should we stay together for the kids? Do they have shared friendships? What is their support system? There's nothing wrong with staying together for the kids, but if the only reason they're staying together is for the kids, it tends to make the kids responsible for the marriage and puts a lot of pressure on them. And we've all had people who grew up saying, God, I wish my parents had just gotten divorced. Sometimes people want to stay together until the kids go to college. Kids are still affected in college when their parents divorce. So I would encourage people to make decisions not based on necessarily what they think is best for the kids, but first put their relationship first. What do they think is best for the two of them, and then assess how they think their kids are doing. Their conflict in their marriage may actually be worse for the kids than having an intentional divorce, and letting their kids see the two of them find new relationships that are stable and loving and conflict-free. Do you share interests and hobbies? So are there places that the two of them can find interesting things to do together? Are they convinced that there's nothing left in their relationship that they enjoy together? They can't travel together, they don't play sports together, they don't take walks, so there's really nothing of interest. Sometimes I see couples where one wants to move to the beach and one wants to move to the ocean, or one wants to move to a different country, or what I see as almost predictively destructive is when they have different political party interests, which is almost impossible to resolve. Number 5 is, do you threaten to leave when you argue? Are you always using divorce as a threat? Are you using it as an exit all the time? Maybe you've been planning on divorcing all along. If you continue to do that, your partner will divorce you. So stop with using divorce as a threat, and let's talk about, do you really want to divorce? The other really important question is, how much couples therapy have you tried? Have you tried to go to counseling at least 3 times with 3 different therapists? It takes a while to find someone that is actually going to be helpful for your relationship one way or the other, to help you decide if you're going to divorce or stay together, to help you with an intentional decision. And finally, are you ready to leave? Do you have a contingency plan already mapped out? Do you have your bags already packed? Let's talk about how far down the road you are with this plan. in the resource section, I give you a worksheet, Ending Your Marriage with Integrity, and it has these questions and more that you can use either as a handout to send home, to get people to journal or think about it, or you can use them in the sessions with people. I think the most important intervention is letting people know that you're not abandoning them. People will want to know, well, who are you going to stay with? Are you going to pick one of us? That's really not the issue. The issue is, if you choose to go on with an intentional divorce, you'll continue to see them through the process up until the point where it's time to have separate therapists, and that you'll continue to discuss that with them. So there's 3 phases of this, just like in the other sessions that we talked about. There's the crisis phase, there's the insight phase, and there's the vision phase. And let's go through what happens in each of those. In the crisis phase, you're really making sure that everyone is safe, right? Securing the family, dealing with the intense affect, but making sure everyone is safe and that you're not trying to necessarily be the rescuer, but witnessing what's happening. So you're reframing the strategy. So your roles are going to shift from I was the therapist that was working on what we can do to keep you together. Now I am more of a coach to let you know what your options are and help you work through the grief and pain of what is the potential of splitting apart and becoming a new partnership. What is your new partnership going to be? I will help you be that person. So that insight, that intention phase, your roles change in your relationship and the relationship of the therapist to the couple. So as you help them with their financial issues and their questions, you're going to help them to understand that those ties are going to have to be cut one way or the other. In the beginning, everyone's very generous and it's going to be fine. I'm going to take care of you. You want to do that work while people are still in that phase and help them to advocate to find financial advisors that will help them set that strategy up while things are still in the good communication phase. If they find legal representation that's very adversarial, they will end up in financial battles that do not align themselves with intentional divorce. So you want to reframe internally how we're going to do this and get the commitment and the buy-in from both of them. If we do this, we're going to do it intentionally. We don't want to hurt each other. We're not doing divorce as a weapon. That divorce is equal to the amount of anger that each person has against each other. So, in other words, you can weaponize divorce as a punishment for the anger that you hold towards your partner. And divorce should not be the weapon that you use for revenge. And if we can reframe it so that it's really about completing your marriage, and there's many levels of completion. There's the financial level of completion where the ties have to be cut. There's the legal completion where you need some kind of advocate. We'll talk about that. And then there's the reframe internally of your roles that has to be completed. And then there's an energetic marriage that has to be completed. And that, I think, is the most difficult. And then we don't talk about it enough. You know, when you marry someone, you energetically partner with them and you make a decision to share their energy and to be married, to be a married person. There has to be a real energetic letting go. I think about the Chris Martin and Gwyneth Paltrow of the letting go into the waves. Understanding that there's waves of this experience that are going to come in and go out. And because of how we look at divorce in our culture, there's a lot of shame about being divorced. I remember when I was going through my divorce, just admitting that I was going through a divorce or getting divorced as a couples therapist was really hard. It was really difficult. I was actually in my Imago relationship therapy training when I made the decision that I knew I had to let go of my marriage. My husband at the time did not want a conscious marriage. He did not want the marriage that I wanted. He actually wanted me to be a dental hygienist so I could be home every day at 4 o'clock. and really felt a lot of pressure being married to a therapist that kept pushing more and more of intentional relationship and an integrated relationship. And he was happy to be married forever. He just didn't want to be married in the way that I needed to be married. And so as a therapist, I had to make a decision about, should I stay together so that the community wouldn't see me as someone with a failed marriage? And how could I be a marriage therapist if I was getting divorced? How was I going to help people in couples therapy if I was divorced? And what would they think when they asked me, how long have you been married? Are you married? Do you have kids? Because I believe in being transparent. I wasn't going to hide or lie. And there's shame involved in that. John Bradshaw talks about shame as shame is a healthy human emotion, but it can be transformed as a whole state of being, where it takes over your whole identity. He said, to have shame as an identity is to believe that one's being is flawed, that one is defective as a human being. Once shame is transformed into an identity, it becomes toxic and dehumanizing. Toxic shame is unbearable and always necessitates a cover-up, a false self. So that's what we've been talking about creating that false self and compartmentalizing who you really are, right? Hiding that other part of you that needs to be reintegrated in order to heal from shame, in order to live in your whole self. Since you feel that your true self is defective and flawed, you need this false self, which is not defective and flawed. He says once you become a false self, you create that part of yourself to exist psychologically. To be a false self is to cease being an authentic human being. So in other words, it's to cease living as an integrated part of you, an integrated whole person. The process of self-formation is what Alice Miller calls soul murder. As a false self, one tries to be more than human or less than human. Toxic shame is the greatest form of learned domestic violence there is. It destroys human life. Toxic shame is the core of most forms of emotional illness. And so we know that shame around divorce is so prevalent. And yes, it's very toxic. So I think soul murder is a good choice of words when we talk about how it feels to get divorced. How can we as therapists help people to integrate the parts of themselves that feel shame? What does marriage mean to them? What is the story they make up about getting divorced? What was divorce like in their family? Are other people divorced or separated? How do other people see divorce and separation in their family? I grew up in my mother was Catholic, and when she got divorced, or when she broke up with my father, he was allowed to go back to the church, but she was not. At the time, you were not allowed to be divorced in the Catholic Church. And she was the one who was religious. He would have burst into flame if he walked into the church. And she was very hurt and felt very betrayed. She had a lot of shame about that relationship breaking up and about that relationship in general. And there was a lot of secret keeping, and we're not allowed to talk about certain things about their relationship and the way we grew up. And she had a lot of anger and resentment at the Catholic Church. And so a lot of that shame came from the idea that one did not divorce, right? So where is the religious background of your clients? Where's the learning, the integration around how people feel about divorce? That's still very real. So for you as the therapist, what's very real for you? Where do you integrate the idea of divorce? What is one thing that you might even be afraid might come up in sessions, that might trigger feelings of you and how you might react? Are there issues around divorce in your marriage? Are there issues around divorce in your parents' marriage? How do you feel about it in your own religious beliefs? Where do you come from when you talk about marriage? In your religion, is it okay to divorce if the couple isn't having sex? Is it okay to divorce if there's domestic violence? Or is it always important to stay together for the children? Where do you fall on your beliefs and countertransference? So an exercise you might want to do is to think about one thing I'm afraid that might come up in sessions. And I think that would trigger feelings of what? What do you think you might feel? And how do you think you might react? And what are some ways that you could handle that? If you have a supervisor or a supervision group, you might want to talk about this in a group, or do this with another therapist, and validate and empathize, and then switch and see what each of you comes up with. Or take a minute and just journal these responses and just notice what happens for you when you think about the endings of relationships and legal divorce. Going back to that New York Times article, another quote is, "As it turns out, the world of moral absolutes is ill-suited to divorce. It isn't a question of good, bad, success, failure, right or wrong. It's a recognition that what existed is irretrievably broken and that something else must be built in its place. Something else must be built in its place." So we're really moving from one place to another. We're not coming to the end and dropping off a cliff. There is something else beyond this. When we talk about the end of marriage, the destruction, the failure, we're actually in many ways seeing it through the financial lens of a partnership, the corporation, the business of our marriage that we've built. So there's a financial release. And how do we maintain integrity and respect without destroying each other financially? Because the adversarial nature of divorce is such that we use money and the idea of money and as a resource to punish each other depending on how angry or hurt we are. The level of hurt can sometimes be measured with the level of financial recourse. So intentional coaching can include encouraging people to find a mediator, divorce mediator, or doing the mediation yourself, or finding a collaborative attorney. Collaborative attorneys decide and commit that both partners will be committed to finding an agreement and that they will not become adversarial and increase fees or encourage financial ruin for each partner. And they will also help you create a parenting plan, which is important before you go through with the final legal steps. So you can assist in the process of that intentional disengagement, whether it's financial or parenting. You could do a lot of that collaboration before they go to the mediator, before they go to the collaborative attorney. The more work you can do with them in the session, the better. The more you can help them before that legal completion, the more trauma they can avoid that they may not even be aware is going to happen. You can help them choose their legal team, to find a way to move forward in a restructured way. Finding intentional attorneys. I have an attorney that I worked with for years that we would refer back and forth. Many times he'd send me couples and say, I don't really think this couple should get divorced. I think they need therapy. They didn't go through enough therapy, or they didn't have the right therapist, so I'm sending them back to you. And I would see them, and many times we could work through what they were going through, or else get to a more intentional place before I sent them back to the attorney. Sometimes he would send me people and say, these people really need to work through their parenting plan before they get divorced. This is going to be a mess. So I would work with them for a bunch of sessions until they came to a more intentional agreement. And sometimes when I felt like people were ready for an attorney, I was very comfortable sending them to him, who could do the collaborative divorce where they didn't need to have two separate attorneys, who would represent both of their interests. And his intention was always to serve as an ally for me and for both of them. And he had a great reputation. If I wanted to send an individual to him, he was like a teddy bear, but he was also really rough in court if he needed to be. So I really loved that he could be someone who could mitigate some of the controversy. And he would also help me decide if someone really needed litigation or mediation or could use collaborative divorce. And you can help people decide that too. Where are we going? These are your options. Mediation, where you could meet with a mediator and work through all those details. Collaborative attorneys, or this is what's going to happen if you go through with litigation. This is what's going to happen if you fight over child support. This is what's going to happen if you fight over sharing custody. And how do you deal with, if there are in litigation, can you help people to deal with the opposing counsel? Can you be the counselor that helps them through that process? And how do you help them deal with that energy as they go through the transformation? How do you help them with that release to create healing and psychological growth? So there's the legal letting go, and then there's the energetic letting go. There's a great exercise. I'm going to give you this handout. But letting go, really letting go truly, means understanding that your relationship may not be what it was in the past. And this is the beginning of a new type of partnership, or maybe co-parenting, or totally letting go for both of you. So this is where you can focus on a new vision for your partner. What would you really desire and want for them? So there's no wrong way to do this if you're focusing on their well-being. And so here's an exercise I'm going to give you that you can do face-to-face or in a letter. Sometimes I recommend that people write this out in a letter. It's a letter to your soon-to-be ex, and you can burn it, you can bury it. It's part of creating a ritualized, energetic letting go. It's also really helpful with the grieving process. You can do this if you're working with an individual or working with a couple, or they can share it in a ritual in your office or with each other. I've done it both ways where people are just in tears. It's very emotional. I did it myself around my divorce, and you might want to do it for you, even if it was a relationship that ended years ago. Think about a relationship you had when you were young, or maybe there's still feelings that you have for an ex that you have energetically not totally let go of. This might be a great exercise for you as a therapist to do as you work through your own issues of intentional divorce. Even if you've been divorced for years, I've been with my current partner for about 20 years, even if you still have old feelings that are not quite reintegrated, if you haven't quite integrated them into who you are as a person, you may be holding on to some compartmentalization because of shame. And so can you do the rest of this work to really heal some of those feelings towards your ex? So there's six questions, 6 sentence stems that you're going to fill out as a letter to your ex. The first one is, one thing I've appreciated about being in a relationship with you. So even if people have really hard feelings, if they're really angry and resentful, if they feel betrayed, the idea is, can you focus on the things that that went well? Can you focus on the thing you actually appreciated about that person? I appreciated that you were always a good parent to our children. I appreciated that you made such a great effort to make our marriage work. What are the things you appreciated about being in the relationship? And then one thing I am deeply sorry for. So what can I take responsibility for in the relationship that I need to apologize for? And again, you can give this to your partner or not. I haven't seen too many people actually give a letter to their ex. It's just the writing of the letter that's really powerful. One way I will always care for you, and sometimes when I get to this one, I get a little choked up. It's such a deep reminder of how connected we are to the people that we've committed to in the past, and that connection, that love never goes away. I don't care how angry or hurt or betrayed you are, there is always a part of us that will love the people that we've loved in the past. One thing I always dreamt about for our relationship was, so this is part of the grief of letting go of the vision, of the dream that you had that doesn't come to fruition. And then taking responsibility for it. One way I may have prevented this from happening was, and then the final one is, one way I can help you now to move in the direction of your dreams. How can I help you become the person that you were meant to be, even if we're not together? This is a very powerful exercise. I would give yourself time and space to process it and to know that it's a grief exercise, and it's also incredibly powerful letting go exercise. To grieve such an intimate relationship, you have to first appreciate it to move into deeper levels of goodbye. Grieving the vision that you had, it's not so much you're grieving the person. It can feel like a death, but it's not the death of the person. It's the death of what you thought could have been or should have been or was going to be. And what you should have been is different than what the person should have been. You're not grieving that my ex should have been this guy that I imagine he could have been, and I'm grieving the fact that he never became that. I'm actually grieving what I thought I was going to become in that relationship. I thought I was going to grow into this particular person, and that didn't happen. And so I'm letting go of that person that I thought I was going to be. And that's very painful and also incredibly powerful in order to move into the next phase of who you can become. This is part of a ritual that you could do. It's part of the moving into the waves of the ocean. You could take the letter and burn it. You could take the letter and put it into a bucket of water. Whatever you feel is your sign. You could bury it in the earth. You could release it into the wind. But this is a lesson, a ritual that you might want to use. One way that you could speak it out loud is to use this energetic release ritual. And I'll read it to you, but I'll also give it to you in your handout. I release being with blank, and you could say their name. Our energetic partnership is completed. We have learned all of our karmic and spiritual lessons. I'm grateful that we recognized each other in this lifetime, and our energy was entangled for the time that we were together. With gratitude and love, I release and I send them love, see them whole, and now dissolve my ties and see myself centered and whole. So just take a moment, even if you want to do this in your mind, and release the person that you've loved in the past. Send them appreciation, gratitude, and love. See them centered and whole, moving forward. Maybe they've passed on. Maybe they're still in this life. And then see yourself centered and whole and releasing them energetically and spiritually. Seeing your karmic work, your mission, complete. So now we've really entered phase 3, the vision phase. And you can create a dialogue that can help heal and disengage and release. So this really facilitates the completion and avoids that trauma, like the energetic trauma of it, and maybe creates a ritual for a happier ending. Why can't the divorce be a happier ending? Why does it have to be traumatic? So what's the vision you have for the next phase of your life and for the next phase for your children? Maybe it's to marry someone else, have another relationship, be single and travel around the world, be a healthier person, get sober, live a life without fear. Like, what is the decision that you made that's going to help you? Another piece of that article that I really liked says the decision to end a marriage is about quitting. It is about letting go of one relationship, but it's in exchange for another. The equation isn't love versus not love. Divorce, at its best, is a love reborn. Birthed from heartache and rage and despair and ultimately forgiveness, it creates a different kind of family. So it may be that you're friends now. It may be that you're co-parents. It may be that you have a single life, or maybe your vision is to be in therapy together. What are the resources? Maybe you're going to play pickleball on the same team. What is that? And how can you create a ritual for some kind of uncoupling? Happy families are not all alike. Some are fractured and misshapen. To appreciate them, you have to adjust your line of sight, your level of expectation. All families have seams and scars, but they're still beautiful in their odd, imperfect way. So grieving the fantasy that you thought was going to work out differently, you now have to grieve all those possibilities. Maybe you're not going to rock on the front porch forever, but you have had some kind of life together. And guilt, there's a lot of guilt. Guilt is different than shame. Guilt is feeling responsible for the things you think you've done wrong, and remorse over hurting your partner. And that can be very intense. So bringing all of yourself into the grief, letting yourself feel it all instead of trying to avoid it. You know, there's a long period of time that's incredibly painful, particularly the first year is the transition year. And letting people know that that time is when they're going to need extra support and they're going to need to stay in therapy. It's not the end of the line where you're done with them or they are done with treatment. So sit down and think about what you want for your future together as partners, new partners, different kinds of partners. If you have children, what's it going to take to make that work? So we've gone through the parenting plan, but what do we want to feel when we drop the kids off every Sunday night? Those transition times are painful. And I know people who have met in parking lots and not spoken to each other, or they've come in for coffee and shared meals, or they've gone on vacations together, they've had holidays together, or they've put their kids on planes and sent them away for summer vacations to the other partner. How is it going to look? And you can't go through this alone. So how are you going to find the support that you need? And now that you've made the decision, let's imagine that you've separated, you're on your way, or you are divorced. Recognize and appreciate your resilience. Whether you stay as the couples therapist or you're working with one or both, or you've sent them both for individual therapy, help the person recognize and appreciate the resilience that it takes to pivot and to find the strength to choose a different path. That what are the solutions that they've come up with, and appreciate the fact that they've been resilient enough to come up with other options and choices. Remind them how strong they are and focus on their strengths instead of what they may perceive as weakness, guilt, or shame. And remind them how well they've coped with the difficulties, the sharing of children or the financial stress or moving out of a home that they may have shared. And appreciate your resilience as a therapist, that you have come up with new solutions that are about pivoting and being resilient, and remind yourself how strong you are as a therapist, that you're able to manage through this crisis phase and bring people through the insight and through these very difficult decisions, and that this is a strength of yours, that you have been able to help them with intentional divorce. This is not a weakness. You have not failed in your therapy. And think of how well you're coping with this, as it adds a new dimension to your integrative relationship therapy. Now you can integrate a whole new tool into your process. So remember, resilience is the capacity to pivot and recover quickly. And ask yourself and your clients, how have you managed to move on? Whether it's a day, a week, a year, a lifetime. If you've known clients that have been divorced in the past and are in their current marriage, their second or third, ask them how they managed to move on when they've ended relationships in the past. What has that been like for them? What has been their strength spots? Where have been the pain points, the pleasure points, and the strength spots? And how did you, maybe you can't identify what you did well, how did you prevent things from getting worse? And maybe you can ask yourself that as a therapist. Maybe you didn't do the best job, but maybe you prevented things from getting worse and more complicated and more expensive. And what is the unique strength that helped you all persevere through this process? Whether it's the couple, whether it's an individual, or whether it's you as an integrative relationship therapist, what's helped you to persevere in your own relationships in the past? Maybe you've admitted to people that you're a divorce therapist or a remarried therapist, or what's helped you persevere through expanding your career into integrative relationship therapy. This journaling activity can help your clients, and it can also help you. It's a great exercise in resilience. First, you write down 5 things you've overcome and 5 things you've accomplished. And I think I'm going to do this today because I really need this exercise. And then you reflect on 10 personal strengths that have helped you overcome whatever you've gone through. And then you write down how you feel about each accomplishment or difficulty you've overcome. This is a cognitive behavioral exercise, and it can be really powerful. You can do this as a therapy exercise. So tell me 5 things you've overcome and 5 things you've accomplished. And then what are the strengths that you think have helped you overcome that? And then how do you feel about those accomplishments or difficulties that you've overcome? Or you can give this as a home assignment. Or if you're with a couple, you could ask them, so what do you think, what can you tell me? What do you imagine that your partner has overcome or accomplished? What are some strengths that they have overcome? And what do you imagine is the feeling that they have about that accomplishment? It's amazing to hear from each partner what the other person has gone through and their own strengths, and to see the partner's face when they hear how their partner perceives them. Particularly if they're coming to the completion of a marriage, it actually sort of solidifies and it's a way of putting in cement the appreciation that each has had for the relationship. So going forward, divorce does not have to mean the end. It can mean the beginning of the next phase of your life, the developmental phase of a new beginning. So ask yourself, as we come to the end of this section, not only the intentional divorce section, but the whole monogamy section, what are some things that you found challenging and might need extra help with? You can talk about those in the consult group after you've completed all the modules, or you can seek extra supervision. What are some things that you have learned, and what's one particular question you still have? Make note of it so that you can come back to it in the consulting groups. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you there. And don't forget to check out The Trouble with Sex.